So we left off with the Gettysburg Address, which was the speech that President Lincoln gave at the site of the Gettysburg battlefield, where they dedicated graves of both Northern and Southern soldiers who were buried side by side at this very important battlefield. We remember that the battle itself was the main turning point in the war, that General Robert E. Lee and the Southern troops had pushed into the north as far as Gettysburg, which is a small town in Pennsylvania, and that it was here that the North was able to stop the Southern invasion and utterly defeat them with heavy losses. And from that battle on, it was a war of attrition. In other words, each side sent as many soldiers into battle as possible, and they won by eliminating the men of the other side. And the North had a lot more men to throw into the battle and a lot more men to sacrifice, both men and supplies, whereas the South did not have any men to replace the men they lost in war, and that's why it's what we call a war of attrition. So they slowly ran out of supplies, they slowly ran out of men from this point on. It was such an important moment in battle that Lincoln and all of the northern representatives gathered at this place to dedicate it as a cemetery, which it still is today, National Cemetery. And he gives this speech, which really is iconic, and it really demonstrates his great oratory skills and really what he was as a leader, a strong leader, but also a leader who wanted to reconcile the parts. The speech itself is very short, it's only 272 words, but as I had mentioned before, it's probably one of the most important speeches in American history. It is also a speech that most American children learn by memory. I actually included the whole speech here to give you a little bit of a sense of it. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In other words, the Civil War was testing whether the Union would survive. And we remember that the Union is the most important thing to Abraham Lincoln. More important than the question of slavery, more important than any economic issues. The Union is the highest good for him. And so they're testing whether that Union can be preserved. I continue. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. So in other words, we're gathered here on the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery, right? But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. So he's saying the men that died here on this ground have already consecrated the ground with their life and with their death. And he's including Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers. There's this, he believes strongly in the union of the whole United States, North and South. And this strong belief that Lincoln has would have been the important link that would have brought together the North and South after the war in a peaceful Reconstruction. But as we will see, that does not happen. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Of course, that's not true because, like I said, his speech is one of the most well-known and well-remembered speeches of all times. However, we do remember what they did at Gettysburg as well. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Right? So this shows his, we're going to take the example of these men who have died. They've given their last full measure of devotion. They've given their life for this cause, and we are going to carry the cause to the end. We are not going to allow them to have died in vain, and we are going to prove that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Remember, the American experiment is really the first full representative democracy that has been born on the planet, right? So it's an experiment for the whole world. And Lincoln wants to say, yes, this experiment can succeed. It is not going to fall apart into pieces. Now, after Gettysburg, about a year later, the South has been divided. We remember that the Ulysses S. Grant took the town of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River and therefore divided the South from the Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana territory. Those states are divided from the rest of the territory in the South. And now we have the decision to take Sherman, a very important northern general, to have him march from the top of Georgia to the other side of Georgia and therefore cut again the South in two. I'm going to get out of the full screen here to take you back to the map of the United States so that you guys can see better what I'm talking about. Remember, we're going down the Mississippi River here, and this is where Vicksburg is, and where Ulysses S. Grant cuts Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana from the rest of the South. Now Sherman, they've had a number of victories in Tennessee. Sherman is going to take his army from the top of Georgia here, and he's going to march it down all the way to the other side of Georgia, therefore cutting again, in another piece, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, cutting them off from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Pennsylvania's up here, so we had the Battle of Gettysburg. The Southern troops were pushed back into Virginia. Virginia is the capital of the South, at Richmond. And when I say they're cut, when the Mississippi River cuts the South in these two pieces, and now Sherman marching to the sea is going to cut across Georgia, he's going to cut into these two pieces. These cutting across the territory means an interruption of transportation. It means an interruption of communication. They can't transport troops, they can't transport supplies, they can't get messages and communications back and forth from these different parts, these different states. So now the South is being completely cut into pieces and will not be able to communicate or transport things back and forth. So that's the importance here of Sherman's march to the sea. So from November until December in 1864, Sherman, with 60,000 troops, marches 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah. And what they end up doing is they take a 60-mile wide path, if you will. Here's your scale up here. So it's about 60 miles wide, with different generals underneath him. And they burn and they pillage and they destroy everything in their path. Most importantly, they destroy the railroads and any communication lines. They destroy the roads, they destroy the cities, they burn everything. This is a very, very good picture to illustrate what happened in this 60-mile swath. So they burn and they pillage everything. They destroy all the railroads. They actually pull up the railroad. They heat up and they pull up the railroad lines and they wrap them around the trees. They actually called these railroad lines that were wrapped around the trees, they called them Sherman's bow ties, because he tied it like a bow tie, but it was the railroad lines. So they would be impossible to easily repair or in short time repair. So this was total warfare. It was brutal, it was destructive, but it did exactly what Sherman intended it to do. And I write it down here at the bottom. It hurt Southern morale. Okay, they're destroyed psychologically. And then it became impossible for the Confederates to fight full capacity and therefore hastened the end of the war because of the cut in communication, transportation, and all of their support one for the other. So with the division of the South in all these pieces and the constant war of attrition that they are suffering, the Southern troops can no longer resist. And finally, at Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Northern Army of Virginia to the general who has been moved from the Mississippi area in Vicksburg, and he was made Commander-in-General of all Northern troops, Ulysses S. Grant, who later becomes a U.S. president. Grant was very generous in the terms of surrender, which was helpful in the reconciliation process between the two sides, looking at them no longer as rebels but as fellow countrymen, which is also the same mentality that Lincoln had and would have had during the Reconstruction period after the war. So he allowed the officers to keep their arms, he allowed the men to take their horses back, um, all of these things which are not usual terms of surrender, but he knew that they would need their arms for self-defense and for hunting, etc. He knew they needed their horses for plowing and for planting so that they would have a harvest, um, and so that they wouldn't die of starvation. So he understood that we no longer can treat them as rebels. We need to treat them as our fellow countrymen once again. And so, putting the war behind them, they would quickly rebuild the nation as one nation once again. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen exactly as foreseen by Grant and by Lincoln, and we will see that later in the next slideshow. So that brings us to the Reconstruction era. Let's look at the whole situation that we're in right now. We have just finished a long, drawn-out, the most bloody war in American history between brothers. Um, Northerners and Southerners were part of the same country. Then the Southern states wanted to uh, break away. The Northern states did not think that this was possible, did not think that they should be allowed to break away. They fight a war over the preservation of this union, but they also fight a war which has as its basis the moral argument of slavery. And so you're talking about human beings that on one side are being treated as property, when we call it chattel slavery, where they are owned by the other person, and therefore can be treated in any way, either well or poorly, and as we know, many were treated with great cruelty. And on the other side we have African Americans who now must become equal and full citizens with equal rights as their white counterparts. Now that's a big jump to go from one extreme, the chattel slavery, to being equal and having all the same rights as those people who just the day before had owned you as a slave. And you can only imagine that this is going to take time. This is going to take a psychological revolution in the people, and it's not something that can happen from one day to the next. So the Reconstruction era is actually an era not to reconstruct, as the word might imply, to rebuild. You might think it's rebuilding the South from the war. Everything's been destroyed and burned. We remember Sherman; he burned everything on his way. So it's not really a moment of rebuilding, etc. It's the period of turmoil, I would say is the best word, turmoil after the Civil War, when the dust has to settle. Um, Unfortunately, as I had mentioned previously, Lincoln is assassinated almost immediately. Only 5 days after the surrender, John Wilkes Booth, an actor who is a Southern sympathizer, shoots Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and the next day he dies. So, unfortunately, the Lincoln who was the great leader who was able to preserve the Union, strong, powerful leader, charismatic leader, who was also able to keep the extreme sides in politics under control, would not be there to oversee this period of Reconstruction. And that's the main, that's going to be the main result of his death, is this Reconstruction period. I noted here in bold and italics, Lincoln looked to Reconstruction as a time of healing. He wanted to heal the nation. He wanted to say, no, the South is a lost brother returning home. It kind of gives you that image of the prodigal son, right? So he was able to keep in check the radical Republicans. He was able to hold them back, stop them from being so radical, and at the same time move ahead with the integration of the newly freed slaves. However, with the death of Lincoln, the radical Republicans were able to take over, and their vision of Reconstruction was very different than Lincoln. They thought of it as a period and an opportunity to teach the South a lesson and to punish them. Okay, so you can see the big difference between the vision of the radical Republicans and Lincoln. It probably would have been an entirely different story if Lincoln had not been killed. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was a Southerner and a former slave owner. So this was part of the compromise on the Republican ticket. When they voted, they wanted to find a combination of candidates, a presidential candidate and a vice presidential candidate, which would attract the most votes. And as you know, so you try to find persons that will attract different groups of society. Well, Andrew Johnson would have attracted those like on the border states, those who were more sympathetic with the South, etc., because he himself was a Southerner and was a slave owner, former slave owner. Obviously, that's going to be really repulsive to the radical Republicans. Radical Republicans are those who are in favor of abolition, and they're in favor of punishing the South, right? So there's tremendous friction now between the Congress and the president, the new president Andrew Johnson, which eventually will lead to his impeachment. However, as all the presidents who have been impeached in the United States, none have been convicted, and that is true also of Andrew Johnson. He was really impeached for political purposes, just like many of the others subsequently. Now, what happens in the South? Right after the Civil War and the African Americans are freed, the Southerners don't want them to go from chattel slavery to all of a sudden becoming perfectly equal with their former masters. Like I said, this is a long psychological process, a long psychological development. So what happens? Immediately they pass what they call black code laws, which are basically restrictions on the freedom and the liberties of these newly freed slaves. They go from everything to prohibiting interracial marriages, to limiting their right to votes, They can't own land or rent land out of a certain area, so they confine them to certain areas, which allows them to not receive the 40 acres of land that were going to be given by the federal government to former slaves. So they try to limit the grants of the federal government. They're just a series of laws that try to take away the newly found freedom of these ex-slaves in the South by the southern states. Obviously, this angers the radical Republicans. So we have a imposition of martial law. In other words, the military is in control in the South, and the radical Republicans in Congress start to enforce their Reconstruction program, their radical and punishing Reconstruction program on the South, despite the vetoes of President Johnson. So they're able to override his vetoes. They passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, these are good amendments. They are the famous amendments after the Civil War, what we call the Civil Rights Amendments. The 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery. Slavery is unconstitutional and illegal. So there is no more slavery in the United States with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that, okay, all of the citizens have the same rights, and these rights cannot be taken away without due process of law. Due process of law here is basically referring these rights in the due process of law is referring back to the first 10 amendments. We remember under the Dred Scott case that came to the Supreme Court that Taney said that Dred Scott could not sue even if he were a free man. In other words, even if he were a free man, 13th Amendment freedom, he could not sue because he wasn't a citizen. Well, here the 14th Amendment is saying that all of these free people, and this is an abbreviation of it. This is not the whole text, obviously. All these free people, they are citizens and they have the same rights. All of those rights in that Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments that are given to all the white citizens, all citizens have those rights, and they cannot be taken away without due process of law, which means going to court, being arrested, being charged with a crime, being able to defend yourself, and then being convicted by a jury of your peers. So that whole process of law, these life, liberty, property cannot be taken away without due process of law. They all have the same rights. The 15th Amendment then gives the right to vote to all males, regardless of their skin color. So the 15th Amendment allows black males to vote. We still do not have the right to vote for any women, black or white. So, with radical Reconstruction imposed on the South, they override many of the black code laws, and a coalition of scallywags who are Southerners who sympathize with the North and with the radical Republicans, carpetbaggers who are Northerners who come to the South and try to influence the South in their politics and their economics, and so they take advantage of the post-war era to make a profit and to profit politically as well. And then, of course, African Americans, the newly freed slaves. So we have Southerners who are kind of considered like traitors because they're in league, they're working with the radical Republicans. We have Northerners who go south, and they take their carpet bag, which is their luggage, their baggage, to the south. And we have the African Americans. And with this coalition, they're able to start electing even black representatives to Congress and the state legislatures. So they're able to have much more political influence. However, we have a backlash to the radical Reconstruction program, the radical Republicans, the scallywags, the carpetbaggers, and the freed slaves. The backlash movement includes groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. They're the most significant, most important, and most well-known of these reactionary groups, and they're known as the KKK. The KKK is a secret organization that used terror and violence to fight against these radical Reconstruction programs in the South, and they threatened not only African Americans but also scallywags and carpetbaggers. In other words, any white person who supported the radical Reconstruction program or supported African Americans. It was considered a white supremacy movement in the South. So what did they do? They would terrorize, they would burn crosses outside of the houses of people, they would vandalize the houses, they would hang African Americans. There was a lot of lynching, what we call lynching, of African Americans. They would also beat and sometimes kill white supporters. So it was a very violent and evil time period, if you will, under the reign of the KKK in the South. Um, so finally, all this conflict and racism uh, was a big political force, but finally the Democratic Party was able to win back control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. The Democratic Party, remember, is the party of the South. It's the party of slavery. Let's not forget that, because it's very ironic today. We have the Democratic Party who has today most of the African Americans as members, whereas it was the Republican Party under Lincoln who actually freed the slaves. Now, how does Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period, come to an end? With the election of 1876, Rutherford Hayes, who is the Republican candidate, makes a compromise, and it's known as the Compromise of 1877, which basically said that if you help me get elected, I will withdraw all military control in the South, and I will put an end to the Reconstruction program of the Radical Republicans. In other words, South, I will give you your freedom again to run the South as you wish. In other words, you can elect who you want, you can, have control of your state legislatures, you can have control of your state laws. You are once again full-fledged states with all of your rights, and do not have the imposition from the federal government under the Reconstruction program. Obviously, this was what the South wanted, and so they were in agreement. Rutherford Hayes did become president, and the Reconstruction period officially ended. However, we know that the legacy of the Reconstruction period will continue, and we will see the same kind of conflict, the same kind of discord over civil rights in what we will later study as the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And as we know today, this difficulty of political, economic, and social equality for African Americans has not yet been fully attained in all parts of the United States. So we still have some areas where there is racial tension and even discrimination. And that brings us to the end of the Reconstruction period. So that ends the Civil War, and we will start a whole new era post-Civil War.